May 18th, 2026. These are the most important stories since yesterday. In medicine, researchers restored the brain's own amyloid-clearing system using a 3-dose nanoparticle therapy, dropping amyloid levels 50 to 60% within an hour and keeping treated mice behaviorally normal 6 months later. In science, Cambridge researchers powered lanthanide nanoparticles with electricity for the first time by attaching antenna molecules that funnel charge with over 98% efficiency, producing ultra-pure near-infrared light at roughly 5 volts. In energy, a platinum-free electrolyzer cathode ran for more than 1,000 hours at industrial current densities and outperformed a platinum group benchmark, opening a path to green hydrogen production without the rarest metals. In energy, Britain's March solar installation total of 27,607 rooftop systems was the highest single-month count since 2012, pushing the national tally past 2 million as households shift to home generation amid Gulf conflict fuel prices. In science, a 7-day fasting study tracked 3,000 blood proteins across 12 volunteers and found that the body's major molecule reorganization doesn't begin until after day 3, with over a third of all measured proteins shifting at that point. In economy and tech, 11 weeks of the Strait of Hormuz disruption has cut off Qatar's helium output, leaving South Korean chip makers running through reserves until June, with TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix absorbing the cost shocks into AI compute pricing. Deeper dives on all of this are in today's Century Report, and many are discussed further in today's podcast. Links to both are in the description. Or if you're already here on the podcast, let's get into it now. 2 weeks ago, as we covered here on the Century Report, a Cochrane review of 17 anti-amyloid Alzheimer's trials covering 20,000 patients landed with a hard verdict: no clinically meaningful benefit. The strategy that has dominated Alzheimer's therapy for 15 years, the antibodies that bind amyloid plaque, the marquee approvals, the headline drugs, moved biomarkers and never reached patients. That is where the field was 2 weeks ago. This week, a team at IBEC in Barcelona with West China Hospital Sichuan University and UK collaborators published something in Signal Transduction and Targeted Therapy that opens a different door entirely. Here's the picture. In a healthy brain, amyloid beta gets cleared out through the blood-brain barrier by a transport protein called LRP1, basically like a cleanup crew. In Alzheimer's, LRP1 binds amyloid too tightly. The transport then jams, the barrier breaks down, and amyloid accumulates. So the field had 2 questions on the table for 15 years, and they chose the first one. They attacked the plaque. The team in Barcelona went after the cleanup crew. They built supramolecular nanoparticles, 3 doses, 1 hour after injection. Amyloid beta inside the brain dropped 50 to 60%. Then they let the mice live. 12-month-old mice, roughly equivalent to a 60-year-old human, were reevaluated 6 months later at the age equivalent to 90. The treated animals behaved like healthy mice. No evident cognitive decline. Now here's a caveat, and it's important. Mouse results don't translate 1-to-1 to humans. The path from a 3-dose preclinical study to a clinic is still years. What changed this week, though, is the assumption underneath the strategy. The plaque attack frame ran on the premise that hitting the protein was the leverage point. The Barcelona work shows the leverage point can be a transport system itself. Restore the cleanup crew, and the brain finishes the work it was already trying to do. And the field is no longer running one strategy. UCSF is working a circulating enzyme angle through GPLD1. Heidelberg has a death complex disruption approach through NMDAR and TRPM4. Barcelona itself has a parallel epigenetic reprogramming track. The discipline that ran for 15 years on a single hypothesis is now generating multiple mechanistically distinct paths in parallel on the same clock that closed out the old signal mechanism strategy. So if you or someone close to you is approaching the cognitive screening window, the date when an effective Alzheimer's therapy becomes available just got measurably closer. It doesn't mean it's tomorrow, but the clock running underneath the date is moving faster than it was a month ago, and it's moving on 4 different mechanisms now, not just one. That's what it looks like when one component of a multifaceted problem that we've been stuck on for a generation gets unstuck. Okay, shifting away here. A team at Cavendish Lab at the University of Cambridge published a paper in Nature this week, solving a problem that has been open in photonics for 40 years. Lanthanide-doped nanoparticles emit some of the purest, most stable light known in the second near-infrared window, NIR2, the band where photons travel several centimeters into living tissue with minimal scattering, the band where optical communications most need clean separation between channels. These materials work beautifully in optics labs, and they are electrical insulators. For 4 decades, nobody had figured out how to drive them with current. They sat outside the LED era entirely. What the Cambridge team did is elegant. Rather than try to push electrons through the insulator, they attached a tiny organic dye, 9-anthracene carboxylic acid, to the surface of each nanoparticle. Charge flows into the dye. The dye gets excited into what physicists call a triplet state, which is usually a dead end because the energy is hard to extract at that point. But the triplet then transfers more than 98% of its excitation into the lanthanide ions inside the nanoparticle. The nanoparticle emits its characteristic near-infrared light. The organic molecule is the antenna. The inorganic nanoparticle does the work. 5 volts. It runs. The early performance is modest by mature LED standards, but it's meaningful as a first-generation device. External quantum efficiency above 0.6% on an NIR2 band. Spectral width far narrower than any competing quantum dot emitter in the same wavelength range. The piece that gets me is what kind of door this opens. The triplet-transfer mechanism is general. Any insulating phosphor with the right energy structure can, in principle, be driven this way. Any organic dye that holds a triplet at the matching energy can serve as the antenna. So the next several years of work will run through that combinatorial space and produce LEDs in colors and wavelengths that the current device library cannot reach. What this lets you build is the part that a lot of coverage will miss. Injectable or wearable light sources that see into the body at depths that existing wavelengths cannot reach. Photodynamic therapy, light-activated drugs, operating in tissue where the light could not previously land. Optical communications running on spectrally pure channels, narrow enough to scale data throughput past where current emitters bottleneck. Chemical sensors tuned to molecular bonds that the existing LED palette cannot address. A class of materials prized in optics for 40 years just acquired a power cord. The capability surface that opens on top of that is a new device family arriving over the next several months. All right, shifting away again to a more difficult story here. We have been tracking the Iran conflict supply chain disruption in the Century Report for almost 3 months. The Strait of Hormuz closure, the damage at Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, the helium and LNG bottleneck rippling out into the global chip stack. The full timeline of this arc does live on the ARCS tracker on the website if you want to check it out. But what's new this week is that the disruption is now 11 weeks deep. The first Qatari tanker cleared the strait on May 9th, and Q1 2026 earnings from the 3 foundries anchoring AI compute, TSMC, Samsung, SK Hynix, show the cost shocks fully absorbed into pricing. An operational layer first, because the numbers are important here. The missile damage to Ras Laffan on March 18th carries a permanent 17% LNG capacity reduction estimated to take 3 to 5 years to repair. Qatar produces roughly a third of global helium as a byproduct of those same LNG trains, and helium has no substitute in advanced chip lithography, in cooling, and in leak detection. About 200 specialized cryogenic ISO containers remain stranded near the strait. Vessels rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope add 3,500 nautical miles, and helium boils off in transit, gone after 35 to 48 days. South Korean chipmakers' inventories run only through June. The earnings tell the other half. TSMC revenue up 35% year over year. Samsung's operating profit up more than 8-fold. SK Hynix shares up roughly 200% on the year. Pricing power on AI accelerators is absorbing every cost shock coming out of the Gulf. Foundries pass helium premiums and cryogenic logistics costs through to fabless designers, who pass them to hyperscalers, who pass them to whoever rents a GPU hour. The bill gets paid. The supply chain damage underneath the bill is running deeper than the prices, though, currently show. So let's step back for a moment here. The AI compute stack that everyone has been narrating as a software story, which lab, which model, which contract, runs on a physical substrate concentrated in a single contested geography. Taiwan imports nearly all of its energy and holds about 10 days of natural gas inventory. South Korea imports about 70% of its oil and 20% of its LNG from the Middle East. 2/3 of global bromine, the input for the hydrogen bromide used in wafer etching, comes from Israel and Jordan. The architecture of intelligence, read at the level of where the inputs come from, runs through the same Gulf system that the war is disrupting. Now, what that visibility forces, and this is the part that matters more than the quarterly numbers, is the substrate diversification that the field has deferred while the easy route stayed open. So Tata Electronics and ASML announced a semiconductor manufacturing partnership in India this week, India's largest chip maker. The sole supplier of high NA-EUV lithography. First time that those two have ever paired. That is one move. The next quarter or two will surface others. Second source LNG routes outside the Gulf, helium recovery loops, foundry geography spread across continents rather than two straight dependent economies, alternate bromide chemistry. Each carried a business case before May, but each carries a stronger one, a much stronger one, now. The first tanker clearing the strait on May 9th confirmed any single transit is a contingent event, and the concentration that was priced as a permanent feature of the system was always an assumption that no longer pencils out at the resolution that the earnings report just put on the table. So the next time you pay for an AI service or watch a cloud bill climb or notice the cost of inference holding higher than the model improvements alone would predict, what you are paying for is the physical substrate underneath the capability, finally legible in the earnings calls of the companies producing it. Shifting away again here, Britain added 27,607 solar installations in March. That's the highest single-month total since 2012. Cumulative count crossed 2 million for the first time. 2/3 of the new arrays went on residential rooftops. The driver is the same Iran war fuel shock moving through European energy markets. Household calculations that used to compare the upfront cost of a rooftop array against years of stable utility bills now compares it against utility bills climbing alongside spot gas prices. The math inverted inside a few months. The Century Report caught the leading edge of that inversion back in March when Octopus Energy reported its biggest ever month for solar and heat pump sales. The wave kept building. UK households running heat pumps saw the case sharpen even further. Once your home's energy is electric, your rooftop generator produces the same commodity that you consume. The infrastructure underneath the deployment surge is moving in the same direction. Solar generation crossed 15 gigawatts on the UK grid in March for the first time, with the grid approaching the threshold of running on 100% clean power for a sustained period. The Springwell Solar Farm in Lincolnshire, the largest utility-scale solar project the UK has ever permitted, got consent in the same window. Balcony solar legislation allowing plug-in panels without utility permission is advancing. New home building codes will make solar standard. What's worth pausing on here is what 2 million rooftops actually constitutes. A rooftop solar array is a node that produces in daylight, increasingly pairs with a home battery, and removes the household's exposure to the next geopolitical disruption from the supply mix. 200,000 of those nodes is a curiosity. 2 million reorganizes the topology on the grid itself. Now, if you live anywhere where fuel prices have spiked this year, which is to say much of Europe and a lot of the places beyond, what the UK numbers described is the household scale recognition that fossil-linked electricity carries the volatility risk, and the cost curve of producing your own power crossed the line where producing it became the cheaper option on its own commercial terms. Britain is the data point this month. Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia have shown the same pattern at residential scale. The architecture of domestic energy is being rebuilt one roof at a time, and the rate of the rebuild is now bound less by technology and more by how fast installers can move. All right, let's close out for today. Today's evidence sits across 4 different domains that have nothing obvious in common. A nanoparticle therapy that restores the brain's own cleanup crew, a light-emitting device family that powered up a class of materials prized in optics for 4 decades, a semiconductor supply chain whose physical inputs just became legible inside foundry earnings reports, and a country whose households are rewriting their energy architecture one rooftop at a time. What ties them is the resolution at which each problem is now being read. The brain's clearance pathway was a single line in a textbook a handful of years ago. The proteomic mapping of that pathway, the structural biology of LRP1, the engineering of supramolecular nanoparticles that mimic its natural ligands, the substrate that lets a 3-dose therapy work in mice, was built across a generation of instrument improvement by labs that did not coordinate on a clock that compounded silently until the demonstration arrived. The triplet-transfer mechanism that Cambridge just demonstrated runs on energy structure modeling, surface chemistry control, and emission spectroscopy that did not have the precision for this kind of design a decade back. The gulf disruption is legible in an earnings call because the supply chain instrumentation underneath foundry accounting is finally fine-grained enough to trace a helium container from a straight to a wafer to a GPU price. And 2 million rooftops is a grid topology that was structurally impossible until the cost curve of distributed generation crossed the line, a line crossed by 20 years of compounding improvements in panel manufacturing, inverter electronics, and battery chemistry. Now, if you've ever heard a category of disease called untreatable, the assumption underneath that sentence is being tested at a rate that the prior generation of medicine could not produce. If you have ever wondered what new physics gets built on top of the lab-grade demonstrations that show up in press releases, the device families coming out of this week's Cambridge paper are that answer. If you have ever paid an AI bill that climbed faster than the capability gains seems to, then the substrate underneath that is now visible, and what is being built underneath the visibility on a clock the disruption set is the diversified substrate that the prior single geography routing never built because the easy path stayed open. If you have ever wondered when the rooftop solar curve crosses from interesting to structural, Britain just answered that for itself, and the answer is the month that it took household economics to flip. The 40-year insulator finds its antenna. The 15-year therapeutic dead end finds a different leverage point. The supply chain that was treated as bottomless becomes legible enough that the diversification work funds itself. And the household where a generation of energy policy has been argued and stalled finds it can move on its own when the math flips. The cost curves are bending against the assumptions that locked each of these domains to the prior decade. What's remarkable is that they're bending in the same week. I'll see you tomorrow.